I'm Amy Goodman. President Obama is scheduled to sign the $787 billion economic stimulus plan into law at a ceremony in Denver. Tomorrow in Phoenix, Arizona, Obama is expected to tackle the home mortgage crisis and roll out a plan to stem the huge rise in foreclosures. While there has been much discussion in the media on the state of the U.S. economy, what about the rest of the world? From Greece to Guadeloupe, from Italy to Indonesia, from Chile to China, from Egypt to India. Countries across the globe are feeling the heat of the recession that started over a year ago here in the United States. Japan, the world's second biggest economy, announced Monday it's facing its worst economic slump since World War II. Speaking in Tokyo today on her first trip abroad as Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton called for a coordinated response to revive the global economy. An estimated 50 million workers around the world could lose their jobs by the end of 2009, according to the UN's International Labor Organization. Skyrocketing unemployment rates, rising prices have led to a worldwide wave of protests and strikes. More than 1 million people took to the streets of France earlier this month. Now protesters in the French overseas territory of Guadeloupe are blocking major roads and have stepped up their month-long strike, demanding higher wages for low-paid workers. This is Elie de Mota, the spokesperson for an alliance of over 50 unions there.
We are still calling for a general mobilization. We call for shopkeepers, patrol station managers, supermarkets to close their stores. We ask government buildings to shut their doors so that we get what we are asking for.
Meanwhile, as leaders and bankers of the G7 countries met in Rome over the weekend, thousands of metal workers and public sector employees gathered outside to protest factory closures and job cuts. This is Silvio Marconi.
We can't
relaunch the economy because the economy means consumerism. And if people can't make it to the third or fourth week in a month, if people don't have a strong contract and are losing their jobs, how can you hope to relaunch the economy? It's a huge swindle.
The G7 talks ended Saturday with a pledge to, quote, avoid protectionist measures and refrain from raising new barriers. Protectionism was intensely debated at the meeting, including the Buy American clause in the U.S. stimulus package Congress passed Friday. U.S. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner responded to concerns at the meeting.
All countries need to commit to sustain open trade and investment policies. This is absolutely critical to confidence.
The devastating effects of the financial crisis on the Global South were outlined in new World Bank data released last week. Just ahead of the G7 talks, the World Bank warned that the crisis could push an additional 100 million people into poverty and send child mortality rates soaring. This is the World Bank Vice President for Poverty Reduction and Economic Management, Danny Leipziger.
We think that given the depth of the recession that it's inevitable that it's going to spill over into the developing world. We've identified at least 40 countries that have pre-existing very high poverty rates and expected drops in their growth, which makes them highly vulnerable. Even those that are below the poverty line will be pushed further below the poverty line. We know that after the food and fuel crisis of a year ago, the estimates were that we could see an addition of about 100 million people to the ranks of the poor, and we think that this crisis and its severity will top that.
Meanwhile, here in the United States, the Director of National Intelligence, Dennis Blair, expressed concern last week that the global fallout of the financial crisis, he told Congress, the economic crisis had become a greater security concern than terrorism.
I'd like to begin with the global economic crisis because it already looms as the most serious one in decades, if not in centuries. Economic crises increase the risk of regime-threatening instability if they are prolonged for a 1 or 2 year period. And instability can loosen the fragile hold that many developing countries have on law and order, which can spill out in dangerous ways into the international community. There are some silver linings. With low oil prices, Venezuela will face financial constraints this year. Iran's president faces less than certain prospects for re-election in June.
That's the Director of National Intelligence, Dennis Blair. I'm joined now in the Firehouse studio by Martin Khor, economist, director of the Third World Network. It's based in Penang, Malaysia. Welcome to Democracy Now! And you're with the South Center as well. Talk about the global crisis.
Well, if the U.S. is being hit by this crisis, the developing countries are beginning to be hit even much worse. For example, in the last 3 months of last year, the U.S. economy went down by about 4%. But in Asia, we found the GNP, quarter to quarter annualized, fell by 21% in Korea, 17% in Singapore, 13% in Japan, and even in China, the economy hardly grew at all. If you look at exports, we find that in December, the exports in Taiwan fell by 42%, in Japan by 35%, in Singapore by 20%, and in China by 3%. So we are seeing the beginning of a very serious crisis in the developing countries, and if this crisis is going to last for another 3 to 4 years, as many economists predict, then we are going to see devastating increase in joblessness, in poverty, and in the decline in the economy in many developing countries that will have effects that are much worse than the United States.
Your thoughts on Hillary Clinton, her first foreign trip as Secretary of State is to Asia?
Well, I hope Hillary will not be lecturing to Asia, but will be listening very intently, because the Asian model of development, which is based on free flow of capital and of dependence on exports, was something that was taught to us by the United States and by institutions like the World Bank and IMF. And now this model is suffering a major setback. She should allow Asia